A ruthless millionaire hired a desperate beggar. She agreed to bear his daughter in exchange for money and shelter. But what happens after the birth, no one could imagine. A shocking twist transforms everything that seemed right. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. Helen Morgan stared at her reflection in the foggy window of a closed shop. Her eyes, once bright and determined, now carried the weight of an existence that seemed to have slipped through her fingers like water. The Armani suit she used to wear with pride had been replaced by donated clothes, and her office at San Francisco's most prestigious law firm was now just a distant memory. Her fingers, trembling slightly from the night's chill, touched the silver chain around her neck, the only physical memento she still kept of her mother. The inscription, "To resist is to be reborn," shone softly under the streetlights, like a whisper of hope amid the chaos her life had become. 6 months. That was all it took for her entire world to crumble. The accident that claimed her parents during a business trip still seemed unreal, like a nightmare from which she couldn't awaken. The inheritance, which should have been her safety net, had been lost in a tangle of documents and legal proceedings that she, despite all her legal training, couldn't unravel. Richard, her fiancé, had promised to stand by her during the storm. "We'll face this together," he'd said. But when the financial difficulties began to pile up and her professional reputation started to be questioned for reasons she still didn't fully understand, he simply disappeared. No explanations, no final goodbye. The streets of San Francisco, which she once traversed in her imported Mercedes, were now her makeshift home. Each park bench, each storefront overhang, each doorway became a potential shelter for another night. The pitying glances from passers-by hurt more than the hunger that occasionally tightened her stomach. On that particular night, while looking for a place to shelter from the light drizzle that had begun to fall, Helen was approached by an elegant, middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Dr. Beatrice Cordell. Her smile was welcoming, but her eyes had something calculating that Helen, under different circumstances, would have immediately noticed. "Miss Morgan," said the woman, surprising Helen by using her surname, "I represent an organization that can help you regain your dignity." Helen hesitated. Years of experience as a lawyer made her suspicious of offers that seemed too generous. But when Beatrice mentioned a high-end fertility clinic and a philanthropic project led by a well-known billionaire, something stirred within her. It wasn't just the promise of a roof over her head or regular meals, it was the possibility of rebuilding. "Why me?" questioned Helen, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Because we believe in your potential for transformation," replied Beatrice, extending a card with an address printed in golden letters. "And because everyone deserves a second chance." What Helen didn't notice at that moment was the glint of satisfaction in Beatrice's eyes when she took the card. She didn't notice the discreet nod the woman gave to a dark car parked across the street. She didn't realize that this casual encounter had been meticulously planned, just like every detail of her downfall. As she walked toward the indicated address, Helen clutched the silver chain between her fingers, seeking strength in the words engraved by her mother. What she didn't know was that this night would mark only the beginning of a much larger plot than her own story. A plot she wasn't yet prepared to discover. The clinic where Helen was received bore no resemblance to the charity institutions she knew. Italian marble floors reflected the soft light from crystal chandeliers, and the air conditioning spread a subtle lavender scent throughout the environment. It was as if she had been transported to another world, a world that, a few months ago, had still been part of her reality. After a series of preliminary examinations and interviews with an impeccably dressed medical team, Helen was introduced to Arthur Montgomery, the reclusive billionaire who financed the project. Tall, with graying hair at his temples and a penetrating gaze, Montgomery had a presence that commanded immediate respect. "Miss Morgan," his voice was deep and controlled, "I'm not offering charity. I'm proposing a scientific partnership that can change lives." The project, as he explained, was a revolutionary initiative in assisted fertility, focused on women in vulnerable situations. Participants would receive not only cutting-edge medical treatment, but also the opportunity to rebuild their lives in a safe, controlled environment, his private mansion in a distant village. "Why your mansion?" asked Helen, her lawyer instincts still active despite the circumstances. "Privacy and security," he replied without hesitation. "The project needs to be protected from curious eyes and commercial interests." A week later, Helen found herself crossing the imposing gates of the Montgomery estate. The mansion was a majestic 19th-century construction, surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens and protected by an ultra-modern security system that contrasted with its classic architecture. Sophia, the housekeeper, a stern-looking woman with gentle gestures, showed her to her quarters, a room larger than her former apartment, decorated with discreet elegance. "Mr. Montgomery hopes you'll feel at home," said Sophia, but something in her tone suggested a veiled warning. In the days that followed, Helen began to notice strange patterns in the mansion's routine. Certain areas were completely off-limits, especially the mysterious East Wing, which remained constantly locked. The staff spoke in whispers and avoided certain topics, particularly any mention of Isabella, Montgomery's missing wife. During a particularly silent dinner, Helen tried to approach the subject. "Have you lived alone for a long time?" she asked casually. The silence that followed was dense enough to cut with a knife. Montgomery set down his cutlery with studied precision. "My wife left us 5 years ago," he answered dryly, and the subject died there. But it was Sophia who inadvertently provided the first real clue. While delivering clean towels to Helen's room, she dropped an old folder. Photographs scattered across the floor, among them one of Isabella Montgomery. What caught Helen's attention wasn't just the woman's beauty, but the chain she wore, identical to her own, with the same inscription. That night, lying in her luxurious bed, Helen couldn't stop thinking. The coincidences were beginning to accumulate in a disturbing way. Why had she been chosen? Why did Montgomery insist on keeping her and the other project participants isolated from the outside world? And why had Sophia turned pale when Helen mentioned her mother's chain during breakfast? The sound of footsteps in the corridor awakened her from her thoughts. It was late at night, and the lights in the East Wing, normally off, were on. Through the crack in her door, Helen saw Montgomery walking hurriedly, followed by a man she had never seen before, tall, with features similar to the billionaire's, but with a harder, more calculating expression. "The experiment is progressing as planned," Helen heard the man say, "but we need to accelerate the process." "I won't risk their safety," Montgomery replied, his voice tense. "You're not in a position to make demands, brother," was the response Helen heard before the voices were lost down the corridor. The days at the Montgomery mansion began to take on a different weight for Helen. Each cordial smile from Arthur, each calculating look from Victor, each hesitation from Sophia now carried new meanings. The luxury that had once seemed welcoming began to suffocate her, like a golden cage carefully constructed. During one of her regular consultations, Helen met Dr. Marina Sanders, a geneticist newly arrived on the team. Unlike the other professionals, Marina seemed genuinely concerned about the well-being of the project participants. "Something isn't right here," whispered Marina during an examination, pretending to adjust equipment. "The protocols we're following, they're too experimental." Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. "What kind of experiments?" "Advanced genetic manipulation," replied Marina, her voice barely audible. "We're creating something that goes beyond traditional in vitro fertilization." Before they could continue the conversation, Victor entered the examination room. Marina immediately turned her attention to the monitors, but Helen noticed how her hands trembled slightly. That night, unable to sleep, Helen decided she needed to access the East Wing. Marina's words echoed in her mind, mixing with the discoveries about her parents' involvement with the Montgomerys. Sophia, noticing her restlessness, appeared in her room with a cup of tea. "Tonight?" she murmured, adjusting the curtains. "Midnight. Security takes a 15-minute break for shift change." Helen waited anxiously until the appointed time. When the clock struck midnight, she slipped silently through the dark corridors of the mansion. Sophia was waiting for her near the entrance to the East Wing, holding an access card. "Be careful," warned Sophia. "Some secrets are too dangerous." The East Wing was a complex of ultra-modern laboratories, a shocking contrast to the classic architecture of the rest of the mansion. In one of the rooms, Helen found digital files on each of the project participants. Her file contained information dating back years, DNA analyses, psychological profile, complete family history. In another room, cryogenic tanks lined the walls. Each contained carefully preserved embryos, but what caught her attention was a specific mark on some of the containers: Project Phoenix. A noise in the corridor made her quickly hide behind one of the large pieces of equipment. Victor and a group of scientists passed by, discussing animatedly. "Candidate Morgan's DNA is perfect," Helen heard Victor say. "The combination with the genetic markers we've developed, it's exactly what we needed." "But what about the side effects?" questioned a female voice that Helen recognized as Marina's. "Irrelevant," cut Victor. "The project needs to move forward. My brother has already invested too much time in this for us to turn back now." When the group moved away, Helen took the opportunity to investigate further. On an unlocked computer, she found a folder marked Project Phoenix Phase 1. The files contained videos of Isabella Montgomery, the missing wife, in sessions that appeared to be medical experiments. In one of the videos, Isabella appeared visibly disturbed. "You can't continue with this, Victor," she said, her voice trembling. "What you're doing, it's inhuman. Arthur needs to know the truth." The video ended abruptly, but it was enough for Helen to begin connecting the dots. Isabella hadn't simply disappeared. She had discovered something about Victor's experiments and tried to stop him. Suddenly, the laboratory lights came on. Helen felt her heart stop for a moment. Footsteps were approaching, and she knew she was about to discover if her instincts about the Montgomerys were correct. In a quick and silent movement, Helen hid behind one of the large refrigerated cabinets in the laboratory. Her heart was beating so hard that she feared it might be heard. Arthur Montgomery entered the room, followed by Victor and 2 security guards. "The results are promising, Arthur," Victor was saying, gesturing toward the monitors. "Miss Morgan's DNA is exceptionally compatible with our modifications. In a few weeks, we can initiate the final phase." Arthur looked troubled. "And the risks? I don't want anything to happen to them." "What happened with Isabella is enough." "Isabella was weak," Victor cut in abruptly. "She didn't understand the greatness of what we were creating. But now, with Miss Morgan's DNA, we can finally achieve what we've always dreamed of." Helen observed the interaction, her mind rapidly processing each word. The way Victor spoke of Isabella suggested that he knew exactly what had happened to her. And now Helen was at the center of something much bigger and more dangerous than she had imagined. "The other candidates also showed positive results," continued Victor, moving around the room. "But Helen, she has something special in her. Genetic code. A natural resistance that could be the key to everything." Arthur approached one of the cryogenic tanks, his reflection distorted in the polished metal. "Sometimes I wonder if this whole project isn't a mistake, if we're not going too far." "Too far?" Victor laughed humorlessly. "Brother, we're creating the future. Think of the possibilities. A genetically perfected human being, free from diseases, with capabilities beyond normal. And all thanks to our work." Helen felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't just a fertility project, it was an attempt at large-scale genetic manipulation, using vulnerable women as guinea pigs without their knowledge or consent. At that moment, one of the security guards noticed something strange near the computer Helen had used. "Sir, someone has been here recently. The system shows activity in the last few minutes." Victor immediately became alert. "Search everything. Nobody can discover what's happening here, not now that we're so close." Helen held her breath as the security guards began to check every corner of the laboratory. It was then that an explosion of alarms erupted in another wing of the mansion, diverting everyone's attention. "It's Sector B!" shouted one of the guards. "There's been a failure in the containment systems." Victor cursed softly. "Arthur, we need to go. Now." When everyone had hurriedly left the room, Helen waited a few seconds before moving. It was then that she noticed Sophia standing at the door with a small remote control in her hand. "I activated the false alarm," whispered the housekeeper, "but we don't have much time. Come with me." As she followed Sophia through the dark corridors, Helen realized that the chain around her neck, the last reminder of her mother, had gotten caught on something and broken, falling somewhere in the laboratory. She wanted to go back to look for it, but Sophia stopped her. "There's no time," insisted the housekeeper. "There's something you need to see before it's too late." Sophia led her through a narrow passage that Helen had never noticed before, hidden behind a bookshelf in the library. The corridor ended in a small room, filled with monitors and old equipment. "This was Isabella's private office," explained Sophia, typing quickly on one of the computers. "She left everything documented. Every experiment, every test, every ethical violation, including—" Sophia hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Including what?" pressed Helen. "The real reason why you were chosen," replied Sophia, turning the computer screen so Helen could see. "Your mother wasn't just a legal consultant. She was part of something much bigger, something Victor Montgomery did everything to cover up." On the screen, a video began to play. It was Isabella Montgomery, apparently recorded shortly before her disappearance, and her first words made Helen's blood freeze. "If you're watching this, Helen, it means we managed to bring you here, and that the time has come for you to know the truth about your parents." Isabella Montgomery's face filled the computer screen, her eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and fear. Helen felt her legs weaken and had to lean on the desk as she listened to the message that had been kept for so long. "Your DNA isn't special by chance," continued Isabella in the video. "Your mother participated in the first experiments of Project Phoenix more than 30 years ago. She was one of the original scientists working alongside Victor, but when she discovered his true objectives, she tried to destroy all the research." Helen felt the world spin around her. Her mother, the respected jurist she knew, had been a scientist. How was this possible? "Victor was obsessed with creating a superior genetic lineage," explained Isabella. "Not just free from diseases, but with enhanced capabilities. Your mother realized that the experiments were unethical and potentially dangerous. She and your father began gathering evidence to expose everything." Sophia, who was observing Helen's reaction, added softly, "That's why they needed to be silenced." In the video, Isabella continued, "I managed to hide part of the original research. It's in a secret compartment in this room, along with all the evidence your parents gathered. Victor never knew about this. He thinks he destroyed everything." Helen looked at Sophia, who was already moving toward a panel on the wall. With a click, a small door opened, revealing an old folder and an external hard drive. "But why bring me here now?" questioned Helen, her voice trembling. "Why not tell me all this before?" "Because you're pregnant," replied Sophia, her voice laden with concern. "The latest tests confirmed it, and your baby carries the genetic modifications Victor was looking for." Helen instinctively placed her hand on her stomach. How had she not noticed before? The morning sickness she attributed to stress, the constant fatigue. "Victor planned everything," continued Sophia. "He knew that your mother's modified DNA had been passed to you. He just needed the right conditions to activate certain genetic sequences. The fertility treatment was just a facade to manipulate your genetic code and create something new." In Yi. The video, Isabella made her final revelation. "Arthur doesn't know everything. Victor keeps him partially in the dark, manipulating his guilt over my disappearance. But I didn't disappear, Helen. I'm alive in hiding, trying to prevent Victor from completing his plans." Helen could barely process all the information. Her entire life had been part of an elaborate experiment. Her parents hadn't died in a simple accident. And now, she carried in her womb something that Victor Montgomery had been planning for decades. "We need to get you out of here," said Sophia urgently. "Victor can't know that you discovered the truth, not now that you're pregnant." A noise in the corridor made them freeze. Footsteps were rapidly approaching. "Quick," whispered Sophia, handing the folder and hard drive to Helen. "There's an emergency exit behind that bookcase. It leads to the back of the property. I'll try to delay them." "Come with me," pleaded Helen. Sophia shook her head. I can't. I promised your mother I would look after you when the time came, and now I need to ensure that you escape." The footsteps were getting closer. Helen quickly embraced Sophia and ran to the bookcase, which slid silently, revealing a dark passage. Before entering, she looked one last time at the housekeeper. "Sophia, where is Isabella? Look for the Santa Clara Clinic in the mountains. Ask for Dr. Sarah Martinez." It was the name Isabella used before all this began. The bookcase closed again, leaving Helen in the darkness of the secret passage, with only the sound of her labored breathing and the weight of the revelations she had just received. Her future, and that of her unborn child, now depended on her next decisions. The secret passage was narrow and damp, illuminated only by the weak light from Helen's cell phone. Her steps echoed slightly as she advanced, trying to maintain a balance between the necessary haste and care not to make noise. The hard drive and folder with evidence weighed in her improvised bag, constantly reminding her of what was at stake. With each step, her mind processed the recent revelations. Her mother, a scientist disguised as a lawyer, the secret project that cost her parents their lives. Isabella Montgomery, alive and hidden, and now a pregnancy that wasn't just a pregnancy, it was the culmination of decades of genetic manipulation. The tunnel began to slope upwards slightly, and Helen felt the air grow fresher. After what seemed like an eternity, she found a rusty metal door. With effort, she managed to open it, emerging amid dense bushes at the back of the property. The night was clear, with a full moon that made her escape more risky. Crouching among the shadows, Helen observed the patterns of the security guards' rounds that she had studied so carefully during her days at the mansion. She waited for the right moment and began to move toward the back wall. That was when she heard the sirens. Red lights began to flash throughout the property. "Attention!" Victor's voice sounded over the loudspeakers. "Participant Helen Morgan has left her designated area. She is confused and may pose a risk to herself and to the project. Find her. Use minimum necessary force." Helen felt a shiver. Risk to the project, not to herself. That was how Victor saw her, just as a guinea pig in his grand experiment. Taking advantage of the initial confusion, she managed to reach a point on the wall where the cameras had a blind spot, another detail she had memorized during her observations. With difficulty, she began to climb, using the old vines as support. On the other side of the wall, the dense forest offered both protection and danger. Helen knew she needed to keep north as a reference to reach the main road, but the thick vegetation made orientation a challenge. As she advanced through the woods, she heard the barking of search dogs. Victor would spare no effort to find her. After all, she carried the result of decades of research in her womb. That was when her cell phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. "Follow the creek to your left. There's a car waiting 5 kilometers north. The key is under the mat. SM, Sem, Sarah Martinez, Isabella Montgomery, a ray of hope amid the chaos." Helen found the creek and began to follow it, trying to stay close to the water to disguise her scent from the dogs. With each noise from the forest, her heart raced. Each shadow could be a security guard. Each movement in the trees could be a threat. After almost 2 hours of exhausting walking, she saw the dim lights of an old car parked on a dirt road. She approached cautiously, always alert to possible traps. But the vehicle was exactly as promised, and the key hidden under the driver's floor mat. When she started the car, she found a GPS already programmed and an envelope on the passenger seat. Inside, there was money, fake documents, and a handwritten note. "Helen, head to the Santa Clara Clinic. Don't use credit cards, don't call anyone you knew. They will be monitoring everything. When you arrive, ask for Dr. Sarah. She will know what to do. And Helen, I'm sorry for everything you've been through. Your mother was an extraordinary woman who gave her life trying to stop this madness. Now you carry not only her legacy, but also the hope of exposing the truth. Drive carefully. Isabella." The distant sound of helicopters made her accelerate. As she drove down the dark road, Helen couldn't help but place a hand on her belly. What had Victor done to her baby? What kind of genetic modifications had he introduced? And more importantly, Was there any way to reverse this? The road ahead of her serpentined up the mountain, disappearing into the darkness. Somewhere, in that direction, was Isabella Montgomery, the woman everyone thought was dead, the only one who might be able to help her understand what was happening to her body and to her baby. In the rearview mirror, the lights of the Montgomery mansion grew increasingly distant, but Helen knew that the real battle was just beginning. Victor wouldn't easily give up decades of research, and somewhere in that whole story, Arthur Montgomery would need to choose a side, that of his manipulative brother or that of the wife he thought he had lost. The Santa Clara Clinic was a small medical complex discreetly nestled among the mountains, about 200 kilometers from the Montgomery mansion. After 3 days of cautious travel, changing direction several times to throw off possible pursuers, Helen finally reached her destination. The place didn't have the ostentatious luxury of the Montgomery mansion, but it conveyed a sense of genuine welcome. The well-kept gardens and modest architecture contrasted with the state-of-the-art medical equipment that Helen could see through the windows. "I'm looking for Dr. Sarah Martinez," said Helen to the receptionist, trying to control the tremor in her voice. The woman studied her for a moment before making a silent call. Minutes later, a middle-aged doctor with graying hair and penetrating eyes appeared in the lobby. Helen immediately recognized that look. It was the same she had seen so many times in the photos of Isabella Montgomery. "Come with me," said the doctor simply. Helen followed her through silent corridors to a private room, decorated, with simplicity but equipped with modern technology. As soon as the door closed, the doctor turned to her with an expression that mixed relief and concern. "You look very much like your mother," were her first words. Helen felt tears forming in her eyes. "Isabella." The woman nodded, and Helen could finally see through the disguise. The delicate features that the old photos showed were still there, just softened by time and experience. "Sit down," Isabella indicated an armchair. "We have a lot to talk about, and your condition requires special care." "My baby," Helen began, her hand instinctively on her belly. "What did Victor do?" Isabella sighed deeply. "Victor was always brilliant, but his genius is tainted by obsession. He discovered a way to activate certain dormant genetic sequences that your mother helped create before discovering his true plans. What sequences are those? Genes that theoretically could enhance human capacity, strength, endurance, intelligence, but the modifications are unstable. All previous attempts—" Isabella hesitated. "Let's say they didn't end well." Helen felt a chill down her spine. "And my baby?" "It's different." Isabella turned on a monitor that showed complex DNA sequences. "Your DNA, inherited from your mother, has a unique stability. Victor spent years studying this, waiting for the right moment. When he found out you were pregnant, he activated the modifications," completed Helen, understanding the extent of the plan. "Yes, but there's something he doesn't know." Isabella typed some commands, revealing more genetic data. "Your mother didn't just create the sequences, she also developed a way to neutralize them. That's why we needed you to get here." A soft sound of knocking at the door interrupted the conversation. A nurse entered quickly, delivering a tablet to Isabella before leaving. "Victor is moving his pieces," said Isabella, showing Helen satellite images. "He has teams searching all clinics within a radius of 300 kilometers from the mansion. How much time do we have?" "Not much. The treatment to neutralize the genetic modifications will take a few weeks, and we need to start immediately." Isabella paused, her eyes fixed on Helen. "But there's a risk. The process has never been tested on a pregnant woman." Helen felt the weight of that information. It was an impossible choice: maintain the genetic modifications that Victor had forced on her baby, or risk an experimental procedure to reverse them. "There's one more thing you need to know," continued Isabella, her voice softening. "Arthur is not the man you met at the mansion. Victor has kept him under control through drugs for years, since my supposed disappearance. He is as much a victim as we are." Helen processed the information, remembering Arthur's moments of lucidity when he questioned his brother's methods. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Arthur is on his way," replied Isabella, showing a message on her cell phone. "He discovered the truth about Victor, about me, about everything. And now we have to decide quickly. Are you ready to start the treatment before Victor finds us?" Helen looked out the window, observing the mountains that surrounded the clinic. Somewhere out there, Victor Montgomery was approaching, determined to recover what he considered his greatest scientific achievement. At the same time, Arthur was coming, not as an enemy, but as someone who had finally awakened from a long nightmare. Her hand gently caressed her belly, feeling the small movement that for the first time she perceived there. Her baby, her choice, her future. The first rays of sun were beginning to appear behind the mountains when Helen made her decision. "Let's start the treatment," she said firmly, facing Isabella's gaze. "I can't allow my child to be part of Victor's experiment." Isabella nodded, immediately beginning preparations. The clinic, which had seemed tranquil moments before, transformed into a center of controlled and precise activity. Equipment was prepared, preliminary examinations were conducted, and a specialized team was mobilized. "The treatment will be divided into 3 phases," explained Isabella, while preparing a series of solutions in a special laboratory. "First, we need to stabilize the existing modifications so we can map them completely. Then we'll introduce the neutralizing agents your mother developed. Finally, a period of observation to ensure all alterations have been safely reversed." Helen observed each movement attentively, still processing how her mother, whom she had always known as a brilliant lawyer, had actually been a revolutionary genetic scientist. "Why did she never tell me?" "To protect you," answered Isabella, checking complex monitors. "The less you knew, the safer you would be. At least that's what we thought." A discreet alarm sounded on the main computer. Isabella quickly checked the security cameras. "Arthur has arrived," she announced, her voice betraying a mixture of emotions. "And from what I can see, he came alone." Helen felt her heart accelerate. "Can we trust him?" "We'll find out," replied Isabella, adjusting her Dr. Sarah Martinez appearance. "Marina, my trusted assistant, will bring him here through a secure path. Meanwhile, we need to start the first phase of your treatment." While Isabella prepared the initial procedure, Helen could hear footsteps approaching down the corridor. The door opened, and Arthur Montgomery entered the room. His face showed clear signs of exhaustion and anguish, but his eyes were different, clearer, more focused than Helen remembered seeing at the mansion. "My God, Isabella," he whispered upon seeing his wife, his legs weakening slightly. "All these years." Isabella maintained professional composure, although Helen could see, her hands trembling slightly. "Arthur, we need your help. Victor—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice laden with guilt and determination. "I know everything now. The drugs he gave me disguised as medications for depression. When I stopped taking them a week ago, the memories started coming back. What he did to you, to Helen's parents, to all those women." Arthur approached Helen, his eyes full of remorse. "Forgive me, I should have realized, should have prevented—" "There's no time for that now," cut in Isabella, turning her attention to the monitors. "Did Victor discover your absence?" "Yes. But he believes I'm looking for Helen on my own. I bought us a few hours at most. He has teams moving in all directions." A new alarm sounded, this time more urgent. Marina entered the room hurriedly. "Dr. Martinez, we detected suspicious movement on the secondary roads, 3 vehicles approaching from the west." "Victor," murmured Arthur. "He must have tracked me." Isabella quickly began typing commands into several computers. "Helen, we need to start now. Arthur, you need to make a decision. Stay with us or go back to keep Victor distracted." Arthur looked long at the wife he thought he had lost, at Helen, who carried the result of years of his brother's manipulation, and at the monitors showing the vehicles approaching. "I won't run away this time," he said firmly. "But I need to buy time for you. Victor still trusts me, or at least thinks he can control me. I can convince him that Helen isn't here, direct him to another region." Isabella hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between strategic necessity and fear of losing her husband again. "Arthur, this time will be different," he assured her, moving closer to her. "Now I know the truth, and when all this is over, We'll have time to recover the lost years." Helen observed the couple's interaction while the medical team began preparing her for the procedure. The love between them, even after so many years of forced separation, was palpable and painful to witness. "Take care of her," Arthur asked Isabella, referring to Helen. "And the child. Don't let the work of Victor's life destroy another family." With one last look at his wife, Arthur quickly left the room. Isabella took a deep breath, composing herself, and turned her full attention to Helen and the treatment. They needed to begin. "Ready?" she asked, holding Helen's hand. Helen nodded, lying down on the prepared stretcher. As the team initiated the procedure, she couldn't help but think about how so many lives had been intertwined by fate and by one man's obsession. Now, in that mountain clinic, all those stories converged at a decisive moment. The initial treatment was intense. Helen felt every cell in her body reacting to the substances introduced into her system. The monitors around her recorded dozens of different parameters, all carefully observed by Isabella and her team. "The markers are responding," announced Isabella, studying the readings. "The modified DNA is beginning to stabilize. Now we can precisely map the changes that Victor introduced." Marina, monitoring the security cameras, kept everyone updated on the external situation. Arthur had managed to intercept Victor's teams, redirecting them to a false trail to the north. But everyone knew it was just a matter of time until Victor realized the deception. During a pause in the treatment, while her body adjusted to the first interventions, Helen finally had a chance to examine the documents she had brought from the mansion. The external hard drive contained years of research, including videos of previous experiments that made her stomach turn. "Victor didn't start with pregnant women," explained Isabella, observing Helen's reactions to the files. "In the beginning, they were just attempts at genetic enhancement in adults, but the results were always unstable. It was your mother who discovered that the modifications needed to be introduced during gestation to have a chance of success. And when she realized Victor's real plans, she tried to destroy everything," completed Isabella. "But Victor had already made copies, kept samples. He just needed to wait for the right moment. A pregnant woman with the specific DNA your mother had mapped." An alarm sounded. Again, this time more urgent. Marina came running into the room. "Dr. Martinez, we intercepted a transmission. Victor discovered the deception. He's coming here personally and—" She hesitated. "He's not alone. He brought a complete medical team." Isabella paled. "He intends to continue the experiment right here." "How long until we complete the treatment?" asked Helen, feeling her heart race. "The first phase is almost complete, but we still need at least 6 hours for complete neutralization," replied Isabella, checking the data. "And we can't interrupt the process in the middle. It would be too dangerous for you and the baby." Helen tried to get up, but Isabella stopped her. "You need to stay connected to the equipment. Any sudden movement now could compromise the entire treatment." Isabella's cell phone vibrated. A message from Arthur. "Victor discovered everything. He's furious. I tried to stop him, but he has armed guards. I'm on my way to the clinic. Stay safe." Isabella began accelerating preparations for the second phase of the treatment, her hands moving precisely between equipment and samples. "Marina, initiate the security protocols. Lock all entrances except the emergency route." Helen observed the movement around her, feeling helpless, trapped by the monitors and equipment. That was when she noticed something in the files she was still examining, a detail that had escaped everyone. "Isabella," she called, her voice trembling with excitement. "Look at this." In the oldest documents, there were detailed annotations by her mother about a specific component of the treatment, an element that could accelerate the entire neutralization process. "Of course," exclaimed Isabella, studying the notes. "Your mother had already anticipated an emergency situation. With this modification to the protocol, we can reduce the total time to less than 2 hours." A distant sound of helicopters reached them. Victor was approaching, bringing with him years of obsession and the desperation of seeing his most important project slipping from his hands. Isabella immediately began implementing the modifications to the treatment, meticulously following the notes left by Helen's mother. The new cocktail of substances was more intense. making Helen feel each moment of transformation in her body. "Hang in there," whispered Isabella, monitoring Helen's and the baby's vital signs. "Your mother left a legacy of protection, not destruction, and now finally we can complete what she began." Through the window, Helen could see the sky darkening with the approach of a storm, as if nature itself was responding to the tension of the moment. Somewhere out there, Victor Montgomery was approaching, determined to recover what he considered his greatest experiment. But in here, protected by the science her mother had developed out of love, not ambition, Helen felt stronger than ever. The baby moved in her womb, as if responding to the changes happening in its genetic code. Helen placed her hand on her belly, whispering a silent promise. This time, the cycle of manipulation and control would be broken. Her child would be born free from Victor Montgomery's ambitions. The sound of helicopters was becoming increasingly close, mixing with the first thunders of the approaching storm. In the treatment room, Isabella and her team worked with calculated precision, implementing the accelerated protocol discovered in Helen's mother's notes. "The genetic markers are responding better than we expected," announced Isabella, studying the results in real time. "The baby is stable, and Victor's modifications are being neutralized one by one." Helen tried to stay calm, but each exterior noise made her shudder. The monitors around her showed dozens of graphs and data, all converging to indicate the success of the treatment. It was a race against time, and for the first time it seemed they were winning. Marina entered the room hurriedly, her face tense. 2 helicopters landed at the emergency heliport. Victor is with a team of 10 people, including armed security. Arthur is trying to negotiate at the entrance, but a distant crash interrupted her words, the unmistakable sound of doors being forced. "How much time do we still need?" asked Helen, feeling a mild contraction. Isabella checked the data. 40 minutes to complete the protocol. After that, we'll need 10 more minutes to safely disconnect all the equipment. "We don't have that time," warned Marina, showing the security camera images. Victor and his team had already entered the main building and were methodically heading toward the medical sector. That was when the lights flickered and all the equipment emitted a warning sound before switching to the emergency power system. "He cut the main power," said Isabella, her fingers flying over the keyboards. "But we have independent generators. The treatment won't be interrupted." Helen could hear raised voices in the corridor, Arthur trying to argue with Victor, trying to gain more time. Victor's voice, normally controlled and professional, sounded altered, almost manic. "You don't understand, Arthur." His voice echoed through the corridors. "This experiment is the work of my entire life. It's bigger than all of us." "It's too big, Victor," replied Arthur, his voice firm. "Too big to be controlled. You've lost perspective of what's right." "Right? Right?" Victor's laugh was bitter. "We're creating the future of humanity and you talk about right and wrong?" Isabella quickly activated additional security protocols, isolating the wing where they were. Fire doors silently slid into place, creating multiple barriers between them and the invaders. "Marina," called Isabella, "activate Protocol Phoenix." Helen watched Marina run to a seemingly normal panel on the wall, which opened to reveal a complex control system. With a series of commands, new security systems were activated. "What is Protocol Phoenix?" asked Helen, feeling another contraction. "Your mother not only developed the treatment," explained Isabella, without taking her eyes off the monitors. "She also created protection systems in various medical facilities across the country. Safe places like this one, where Victor's work could be combated if necessary. A new crash closer made the equipment vibrate. Victor was using heavy equipment to force the security doors. "Isabella," Victor's voice sounded over the communication system, "I know you're there. I know you're with her. You don't understand. The baby is perfect. The genetic modifications worked exactly as we planned 30 years ago. We can't lose this opportunity." Isabella pressed the communicator button. "The modifications are unstable, Victor. You know that. All previous tests failed. Because we didn't have the right DNA." Victor's voice was laden with frustration. "But Helen, she has the perfect combination. Her mother's DNA, modified by us, passed to her in a stable way. "And now with the new alterations we made to the embryo—" "You're playing God, Victor," interrupted Isabella, "and innocent people have died because of your obsession." Helen felt another contraction, this time stronger. Isabella immediately noticed the change on the monitors. "The stress is inducing labor," she murmured, quickly adjusting some parameters. "We need to keep her stable for 20 more minutes." The sound of metal being forced was getting closer and closer. Arthur continued trying to reason with his brother, but it was clear that Victor was beyond reason. "Dr. Montgomery," Marina's voice sounded firm over the communicator, "your teams must have noticed they can't use their cell phones or radios. Protocol Phoenix includes an interference field. At this moment, your men can't communicate with the outside, and soon they'll realize that their electronic weapons also don't work." A sound of frustration came from the other side, followed by rapid orders from Victor to his team. Helen could feel the tension increasing with each second, while Isabella worked tirelessly to complete the treatment before the barriers were breached. The baby moved again, more agitated than ever, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Helen closed her eyes, focusing on the words engraved on her mother's chain. "To resist is to be reborn." Now more than ever, these words carried a deep and vital meaning. The minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The sound of heavy equipment trying to break through the clinic's protections echoed through the corridors, while Isabella and her team worked frantically to complete Helen's treatment. 15 more minutes, announced Isabella, her eyes alternating between the various monitors. "The genetic modifications are almost completely neutralized." Helen breathed deeply, trying to control the contractions that were becoming more frequent. Through the security cameras, she could see Victor coordinating his team with obsessive determination, while Arthur desperately tried to make him reconsider. "Victor, look at yourself," Arthur's voice sounded over the communication system. "You're willing to invade a clinic, threaten innocent people, all for an experiment?" "Innocent," Victor retorted with bitterness. "Where were the innocent when our parents died of diseases we could have cured? Where was innocence when nature made us? Weak and vulnerable? I'm creating a future where no one will need to suffer these limitations anymore." Isabella pressed the communicator button. "And how many lives have you destroyed in the process, Victor? How many families have you ruined?" A moment of silence followed her words. When Victor spoke again, his voice was strangely calm. "Isabella, my dear sister-in-law, you were always too brilliant for your own good. Just like Helen's mother, you two never understood that sometimes the price of progress is high." "The price?" Helen couldn't contain herself. "You planned my family's downfall. You manipulated the lives of dozens of women. That's not progress, Victor. It's cruelty." A new contraction, stronger than the previous ones, made Helen squeeze her eyes shut. The monitors immediately registered the change. "Labor is progressing," warned Isabella. "We need to keep her stable for a few more minutes." Marina, who was monitoring the security systems, let out an exclamation. "They found the main panel. They're trying to deactivate Protocol Phoenix." Isabella worked even faster, her fingers flying over the controls. 10 minutes, we need just 10 minutes. That was when Arthur did something unexpected. The cameras showed him approaching the main panel, typing a series of commands. "Arthur, what are you doing?" Victor's voice sounded alarmed. "What I should have done years ago, brother," replied Arthur. "I'm taking control." With a final sequence of commands, Arthur activated new security protocols. Additional doors closed, isolating Victor from his team. "You can't do this," shouted Victor. "I'm your brother." "Yes, you are." Arthur's voice was laden with sadness. "And that's precisely why I can't let you continue." Helen watched the scene through the monitors, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. Victor was isolated but still dangerously close. "Treatment complete," Isabella finally announced. "The genetic modifications have been neutralized. Now we need to stabilize the process and—" Her speech was interrupted by a sharp, metallic sound. Victor had managed to force the last door. "Step away from her," he ordered, entering the room. His eyes, normally cold and calculating, now shone with an almost feverish intensity. "You don't understand. You can't destroy decades of work." Isabella positioned herself between Victor and Helen. "It's over, Victor. The treatment is complete. The baby's DNA has returned to normal. Normal? Victor laughed bitterly. Normal is mediocre. Normal is weak. I created something extraordinary. You created an abomination, Arthur's voice sounded from the door. He had managed to reach the room. You manipulated lives, destroyed families, all in the name of a sick obsession. Victor turned to his brother, his eyes narrowing. You're under the effect of the drugs I gave you. You don't know what you're saying. No, Victor, replied Arthur, calmly. For the first time in years, I know exactly what I'm saying, and I also know that I need to do this. With a quick movement, Arthur activated one last command in the system. Alarms began to sound throughout the clinic. Containment protocol activated, announced an automated voice. All research will be deleted in 5 minutes. Physical backup initiating destruction process. No, shouted Victor, running to the computers. You can't, it's decades of work. Work built on suffering, replied Arthur. It's time to end this, brother. Helen observed the scene while Isabella and Marina began disconnecting her from the equipment. Victor Montgomery, the brilliant scientist who had dedicated his life to transcending the limits of human genetics, now watched helplessly as his work was methodically destroyed. A particularly strong contraction made Helen groan. The baby was coming, and this time it would arrive as nature had planned, without manipulations, without modifications, just the perfection of a new life beginning. The chaos in the treatment room was quickly replaced by coordinated activity when Isabella realized that Helen's labor had really begun. While the clinic systems methodically destroyed decades of unethical research, a new life was struggling to come into the world. Prepare the delivery room, ordered Isabella, her voice professional and firm. Marina, call the obstetric team. Victor remained paralyzed in front of the computers, watching helplessly as years of work disappeared before his eyes. You don't understand, he murmured repeatedly. It was perfect. It was the future. Arthur approached his brother, placing a hand on his shoulder. No, Victor. It was a prison that you built around all of us. Helen was quickly transferred to the delivery room, equipped with state-of-the-art technology that would now be used for its original purpose, to safely bring a new life into the world. The contractions were increasing in intensity and frequency. The baby's vital signs are perfect, announced Isabella, checking the monitors. Completely stable. The treatment worked exactly as your mother planned. Between contractions, Helen could see through the open door, Victor being restrained by clinic security guards, while Arthur supervised the final destruction of the files. The man who had manipulated so many lives now seemed small, broken by his own ambition. Helen, called Isabella, I need you to focus now. Your baby is coming. The following hours were a mixture of pain, expectation, and a strength that Helen didn't know she possessed. The medical team worked with precision, Isabella commanding each step with the experience of years of practice. I see the head, announced Isabella. One more push, Helen. With a last cry of determination, Helen felt her baby finally come into the world. The strong, healthy cry filled the room, bringing tears of relief and joy. It's a girl, said Isabella, her voice choked with emotion as she placed the baby on Helen's chest. Her perfectly healthy girl. Helen looked at her daughter, marveling at every detail of her tiny face. There was nothing artificial or manipulated there, just the pure, natural beauty of a new human being. Sophia, whispered Helen, choosing the name in that moment. Sophia Morgan. Marina, who had just returned to the room, smiled, like the housekeeper who helped save you both. Isabella quickly performed all the necessary examinations, confirming what the equipment already indicated. Sophia was a completely healthy baby, with no trace of the genetic manipulations that Victor had tried to implement. Arthur appeared at the door of the room, his eyes shining at the sight of the baby. Victor is in custody, he informed softly. Investigation teams are on the way. All the other women who participated in the project will be found and given the necessary help. And the research? Asked Helen, still cradling Sophia. Destroyed, confirmed Arthur. All files, all samples. Victor's work cannot be replicated. Isabella approached her husband, finally allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. Arthur embraced her, years of forced separation dissolving in that contact. "I thought I had lost you," he murmured. "You never lost me," replied Isabella. "I just needed to wait for the right moment to fix everything." Helen observed the scene while breastfeeding Sophia for the first time. It was strange to think how it had all begun, with her alone on the streets, holding her mother's chain as the last reminder of a lost life. Now here she was holding her daughter, surrounded by people who had become much more than allies. "She has your eyes," commented Isabella, turning her attention to Helen and the baby. "And I bet she'll have her mother's strength too." Helen smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. "To resist is to be reborn," she murmured, remembering the words engraved on the chain she had lost. "My mother always knew this day would come." "And she left everything prepared," completed Isabella. "The treatment, the security protocols, even this clinic. She ensured that when the time came, we would have a way to protect her daughter and granddaughter." Sophia yawned softly, her tiny fingers grasping Helen's finger. In that moment, all the struggles, all the discoveries, all the fear and all the pain seemed to make sense. A cycle of manipulation and control had been broken, and a new cycle of life, love and freedom was just beginning. 3 months had passed since Sophia's birth. The Santa Clara Clinic, once a secret refuge, had been transformed into a support center for the other women affected by Victor's project. One by one, they were located and brought in to receive the necessary treatment. Helen, recovered from childbirth, now coordinated the clinic's legal department, using her experience as a lawyer to ensure that all victims received the necessary legal support. The case had become public, generating a wave of investigations in laboratories and fertility clinics throughout the country. 3 more women were located this week, she informed Isabella during a morning meeting. Sophia slept peacefully in her baby carrier next to the table. Isabella, who had reassumed her true identity after years as Dr. Sarah Martinez, nodded. "They will receive all the necessary support. Arthur is ensuring that the Montgomery family resources are used to compensate all the victims." Arthur's transformation had been remarkable. Free from the drugs his brother had used to control him, he had taken full responsibility for the crimes committed under the family name. The Montgomery mansion had been converted into a center for ethical genetic research, with a focus on conventional treatments for hereditary diseases. Victor was facing a long judicial process. His actions had affected dozens of lives, and the evidence against him was irrefutable. More importantly, his obsession with transcending the limits of human genetics had become a warning about the dangers of allowing scientific ambition to overcome ethics. On a particularly busy afternoon at the clinic, Helen received an unexpected visit. Sophia, now older and with the same gentle smile as before, had traveled miles to return something special, the silver chain that Helen had lost during her escape from the mansion. "I found it when we were cleaning the laboratory," explained the former housekeeper, placing the delicate jewel in Helen's hands. "I thought you'd like to have it back, to pass on when the time comes." Helen embraced her former ally, tears of gratitude in her eyes. The inscription, "To resist is to be reborn," shone like new, a constant reminder of the strength she had inherited from her mother. Isabella and Arthur, who now worked side by side in the administration of the clinic, had established rigorous ethical protocols for all research. Victor's legacy of terror was being transformed into something positive, an unwavering commitment to transparency and the protection of human rights in medical research. "Sometimes I wonder," commented Helen to Isabella as they watched Sophia play with other babies in the clinic's nursery, "if my mother imagined that everything would end like this when she started developing the neutralization treatment." Isabella smiled, adjusting nearby equipment. "Your mother was a visionary, Helen. She knew that one day science would need guardians, people willing to ensure that progress never came at the cost of humanity." The afternoon sun streamed through the clinic's windows, illuminating the smiling faces of the children playing, all of them born free from the manipulations that Victor had planned were living testimony that true human evolution didn't come from secret laboratories or unethical experiments, but from love, courage, and determination to do what is right. Helen picked up Sophia, feeling the comforting warmth of her daughter. The little one grabbed the silver chain that now hung again from her mother's neck, her eyes shining with the natural curiosity of a healthy and happy child. "One day," whispered Helen, "I'll tell you the story of this chain, my little one, the story of how your grandmother, even without being present, helped us break the chains of ambition and manipulation, and how sometimes to resist really means to be reborn." Marina entered the room, carrying more reports. "Helen, 2 more women have been located in San Francisco. They're on their way." Helen nodded, adjusting Sophia in her arms. The work continued. There were more lives to save, more stories to correct, more futures to protect. But now, unlike when it all began, she wasn't alone. She had a family, not just Sophia, but all the people who had united in that extraordinary journey. Little Sophia yawned in her arms, oblivious to the historical importance of her own existence. For her, the world was simply a place of discoveries and joys, exactly as it should be. And Helen, holding her daughter while preparing for another day of work, knew there could be no greater victory than this: the freedom to be simply human, with all the imperfections and beauties that entailed. A year had passed since the events at the Santa Clara Clinic. The Montgomery case, as it became known in the media, had triggered a revolution in how genetic research was conducted and regulated in the country. Helen, now legal director of the newly created Institute for Ethics in Genetic Research, was about to take an important step in her mission. The auditorium at Stanford University was packed. Hundreds of researchers, students, and journalists anxiously awaited the beginning of the lecture. In the front row, Isabella and Arthur Montgomery watched proudly, while Sophia, now 15 months old, played silently on her babysitter's lap. "Good morning, everyone," began Helen, her firm voice echoing through the venue. "We are here today to officially launch the Phoenix Reborn Project, an initiative that will transform the tragedy of the past into hope for the future." The screens behind her showed images of the new facility, a state-of-the-art research complex built where the Montgomery Mansion once stood. The place that once housed unethical experiments would now be dedicated to transparent and ethical research in genetic treatments. "My mother," continued Helen, instinctively touching the chain around her neck, "believed that science should serve humanity, not subjugate it. Today we honor her legacy by inaugurating the largest center for ethical gene therapy research in North America." In the audience, several women who had been victims of Victor's original project watched emotionally. Some of them now were part of the Institute's administrative team, ensuring that patients' voices would always be heard in important decisions. "The Institute will not just be a research center," explained Helen. "It will also be a living memorial, a constant reminder that scientific progress must always walk hand in hand with ethics and respect for human dignity." Isabella rose to join Helen on the stage. As the scientific director of the new institute, she represented the perfect union between technical excellence and ethical commitment. "Each laboratory in this institute," said Isabella, "will have ethical oversight panels composed not only of scientists, but also of community members and patient representatives. Transparency will be our top priority." Arthur, who had dedicated a large part of his fortune to the project, watched with tears in his eyes. The redemption of the Montgomery family would not come through genetic manipulation, but through commitment to true healing and human care. Marina, now the Institute's communications coordinator, presented the initial numbers. More than 50 researchers had already been hired, and partnerships with universities around the world were being established. "But perhaps most importantly," continued Helen, "is our commitment to future generations. The Institute will include an education center where students will learn not just science, but also the crucial importance of ethics in research." Sophia, as if sensing they were talking about the future, let out a cheerful laugh that echoed through the auditorium, bringing smiles to the audience. Helen looked at her daughter, feeling a wave of emotion. There she was, growing up free and healthy, a living symbol that nature, in its wisdom, needed no artificial enhancements. Today, concluded Helen, we are not just inaugurating a building or an institute, we are inaugurating a new chapter in the history of scientific research in our country, a chapter written not with unbridled ambition, but with compassion, ethics, and respect for life in all its forms. After the ceremony, while the guests circulated through the new complex, Helen found a moment of quietude in the Institute's garden. Sophia played with other children in the specially designed playground, her laughter mixing with the sound of the newly installed fountain. Isabella approached, carrying an old box. "We found this in the archives we managed to save," she said, handing the box to Helen. "I think you should have it." Inside the box, Helen found an old diary, her mother's diary. The yellowed pages contained not just scientific notes, but also hopes, fears, and dreams for the future. On the last page, a message seemed to have been written especially for this moment. "To my daughter, if you are reading this, it means the truth has finally come to light. Always remember, true progress is not in trying to transcend our humanity, but in embracing it completely, with all its imperfections and possibilities. To resist is to be reborn, my dear, and you, more than anyone, have proven that." Helen hugged the diary to her chest, watching her daughter play. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the new institute. A new day was dawning, not just for her and Sophia, but for all who believed that science could be a force for good, provided it was guided by the heart. On a clear spring morning, 5 years after the events that changed so many lives, Helen walked through the corridors of the Phoenix Reborn Institute with Sophia, now a smart and curious 6-year-old girl, holding her hand. It was a special day. The institute was holding its first international symposium on ethics in genetic research. "Mom," asked Sophia, her eyes shining with the curiosity characteristic of her age, "why are there so many people here today?" Helen smiled, adjusting the silver chain she now rarely took off her neck. "Because people from all over the world came to learn how to do science the right way, my love, how to help others without hurting them." The main hall was filled with researchers, doctors and ethics specialists from various countries. Among them, Helen recognized familiar faces, women who, like her, had survived Victor's original project and were now active voices in the fight for a more humane science. Isabella and Arthur Montgomery, who had become international symbols of redemption and ethical transformation in the scientific community, were preparing to present the results of the Institute's first major project, a revolutionary treatment for rare genetic diseases developed with full transparency and participation from the patient community. "Helen," called Marina, now the Institute's communications director, approaching hurriedly. "You need to see this." On one of the hall's screens, a live report showed Victor Montgomery being transferred to a rehabilitation center after years of seclusion. His face, once marked by obsession, now showed signs of repentance and reflection. "He asked to speak with you," said Marina softly. "He said he's ready to contribute, in the right way this time." Helen observed the image for a moment, feeling Sophia squeeze her hand. "Perhaps," she replied, "when the time is right." The sound of applause caught her attention. Isabella was beginning her presentation in the main auditorium. Helen and Sophia found their seats in the front row, next to Arthur. "6 years ago," began Isabella, "this institute was born from the ashes of a tragedy. Today we present to the world the fruits of a new type of scientific research, one that places human dignity above all." The results were impressive, treatments developed ethically, with significant results and without the horrors of the past manipulations. The Phoenix Reborn Institute had become a global model of how science could advance without losing its humanity. After the presentation, during the reception, Sophia played with other children in the Institute's garden, some of them daughters of women who had gone through the original project. Helen watched them, amazed at how life had surprising ways of healing old wounds. "She has your eyes," said a familiar voice behind her. It was Sophia, the former housekeeper, who now coordinated a support program for families affected by unethical research. And her mother's heart, added Isabella, joining them. Strong, determined, but always guided by what is right. Helen touched the chain around her neck, feeling the engraved words under her fingers. To resist is to be reborn, she murmured, watching her daughter laugh and play, free from any manipulation or experiment. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the institute. In the garden, a discreet plaque honored all those who had fought against the unethical manipulation of human life. Among the names, those of Helen's parents occupied a special place. Sophia ran up to her, her eyes shining with excitement. "Mom, can I show my new science project to everyone?" Helen smiled, picking up her daughter. Sophia had inherited the love for science, but also the deep understanding that all knowledge should serve to help, never to harm. "Of course you can, my love," replied Helen. "And do you know why? Because here we do science with the heart." As they walked back to the auditorium, Helen reflected on how her life had changed. From the lawyer who lost everything to the leader of a movement for ethics in scientific research, her journey had been one of transformation and rebirth. The silver chain shone softly around her neck, a constant reminder that sometimes it's necessary to resist what is wrong, to allow something new and better to be reborn. And there, in that institute built on the foundations of ethics and compassion, a new chapter was being written, not just for her and Sophia, but for all humanity. "Mom," called Sophia, interrupting her thoughts, "when I grow up, I want to be a scientist like Grandma, but the right way, okay?" Helen embraced her daughter, feeling tears of joy form in her eyes. "The right way, my love. Always the right way." And so, under the orange sky of that spring afternoon, the cycle was complete. From a story of manipulation and control, a legacy of ethics and hope had been born. Science would continue to advance, but now guided not by unbridled ambition, but by the genuine desire to do good. 10 years had passed since the inauguration of the Phoenix Reborn Institute. On a special autumn afternoon, Helen watched her daughter Sophia, now 11 years old, presenting her science project at the Institute's annual fair. The theme chosen by the girl could not have been more meaningful. Ethics in scientific research, the vision of a new generation. Science, explained Sophia with surprising confidence for her age, is not just about discoveries and advances. It's about how we use that knowledge to help people without ever forgetting that each life is precious and unique. In the audience, Isabella and Arthur Montgomery watched emotionally. Beside them, other children, daughters of the women who had been affected by the old project, awaited their turn to present their own work. It was a new generation growing up with different values, understanding from an early age the importance of balance between progress and ethics. The Institute had become much more than a research center. It was a living symbol of transformation, a place where stories of pain had been transformed into a source of healing and learning. The corridors that once echoed with dark secrets now resonated with children's laughter and animated discussions about how science could improve lives ethically. Helen was walking among the fair booths when she found a surprise. In a discreet corner, there was an exhibition about the Institute's history. Among the photos and documents was her mother's silver chain, now part of a permanent memorial. "It was Sophia's idea," said Marina, approaching silently. "She said other people needed to know the story of the chain, to understand what it means to resist and be reborn." The exhibition told not only Helen's story, but that of all the women who had been unwilling parts of the original project. Their photographs, their stories, and most importantly, their triumphs were documented there, serving as a powerful reminder of what was at stake when ethics were abandoned in the name of progress. Isabella, who had become one of the most respected voices in scientific ethics in the world, joined them. "I received news from Victor," she said softly. Helen felt a slight tightness in her chest. After years of seclusion and therapy, Victor Montgomery had asked to contribute to the Institute, no longer as a scientist, but as an example of what happens when ambition overcomes humanity. "He wants to participate in the awareness program," continued Isabella. "Talk to students about the dangers of uncontrolled scientific pride." Helen observed her daughter from a distance, now animatedly, explaining her project to a group of visitors. Sophia had grown up understanding both the power and the responsibility that came with scientific knowledge. It was a delicate balance that her own mother had fought to protect. "Perhaps," replied Helen after a moment of reflection, "it's time to close that circle too." The fair extended into the night, with presentations and debates that showed how the Institute had transformed the way genetic research was conducted in the country. Doctors, scientists, and students from around the world came to learn from the model developed there. At the end of the event, while helping Sophia pack up her project, Helen found something special, a small diary that her daughter had kept during the preparation of the fair. In the last pages, there was a text that made her eyes fill with tears. "My grandmother was a scientist who chose to do what was right, even when it was difficult. My mother is a lawyer who fought to transform something bad into something good. And me? I want to be someone who never forgets that behind every experiment, every research, there is a human being with dreams, fears, and hopes. Because resisting what is wrong helps us to be reborn stronger, wiser, and more human." Helen embraced her daughter, feeling how her mother's legacy had flourished in ways she could never have imagined. The circle of pain had transformed into a circle of healing, and each new generation that passed through the Institute helped strengthen it. At the end of that special night, as the lights of the Institute slowly went out, Helen realized that her journey had been much more than a story of survival. It had been a testimony to the transformative power of truth, courage, and unconditional love, values that now her daughter carried forward, like a light guiding the way to a more ethical and human future. 15 years after the events that changed so many lives, the Phoenix Reborn Institute was preparing for a special ceremony. It was graduation day for the first class of the Young Scientists program, and Sophia, now 16, was among the graduates. The auditorium was filled with familiar and new faces. In the front row, Helen held the old silver chain, now a relic, of the institute that was occasionally borrowed for important events. Beside her, Isabella and Arthur Montgomery, with completely grey hair but still bright eyes, smiled proudly. Sophia took the stage to give her speech as the class valedictorian. Her eyes, so similar to her mother's, scanned the audience before beginning. 15 years ago, this institute was born from a story of resistance and rebirth. Today, we are not just celebrating our graduation, we are celebrating a legacy of transformation. Each of us here has learned that true science is not about trying to control nature, but about understanding and respecting it. Among the audience, Helen recognized many faces. Marina, who now directed similar programs in other countries. Sophia, the former housekeeper, who had become a beloved counselor for the new generations. And even Victor Montgomery, who after years of reflection and repentance, had become a dedicated advocate for ethics in scientific research. Our generation, continued Sophia, grew up knowing both the power and the responsibility that comes with scientific knowledge. We learned that each discovery, each advance, must be guided not only by intellectual curiosity, but also by commitment to human welfare. Helen felt silent tears run down her face as she listened to her daughter articulate exactly the principles for which her mother had given her life to protect. The circle was complete, 3 generations of women united by the same commitment to truth and ethics. After the ceremony, during the reception in the Institute's gardens, Helen found a moment of quietude next to the memorial that honored the victims and heroes of that story. Her fingers gently traced the names of her parents, feeling how their presence still reverberated through the actions and choices that had shaped so many lives. Sophia found her there, carrying a small box. "Mom," she said softly, "I found this in the old archives of the Institute. I think today is the right day to share it." Inside the box was a letter, yellowed by time, written by her mother shortly before the accident that took her from this world. It was addressed not only to Helen, but also to the granddaughter. She would never know. "To my daughter and my granddaughter, if you are reading this letter, it means our fight was not in vain. Scientific knowledge is one of humanity's greatest achievements, but its true value is not in making us superhuman, but in helping us be more human. Helen, my daughter, your strength was always greater than you imagined. And to my granddaughter, whom I do not yet know, you are living proof that resisting what is wrong allows us to be reborn stronger and wiser. Always remember, the true legacy is not in laboratories or experiments, but in the heart and conscience of each person who chooses to do what is right, even when it is difficult. With eternal love, your mother and grandmother. Helen and Sophia embraced, sharing a moment of deep understanding. Around them, the Institute pulsed with life and purpose. In the research rooms, new ethical treatments were being developed. In the laboratories, young scientists learned to balance ambition and responsibility. In the corridors, stories of transformation continued to inspire new generations. The silver chain, now part of the Institute's historical collection, continued to remind all who pass through, to resist is to be reborn. And through that resistance, through the courage of people who chose to do what is right, a new chapter in the history of science had been written. Sophia picked up the chain delicately, her fingers tracing the familiar inscription. "You know, Mom," she said with a gentle smile, "I think I finally understand. They're not just words, they're a commitment we pass on." Helen embraced her daughter, watching the sun set through the Institute's windows. Her mother's legacy lived not only in the ethical research conducted there, but in the heart of each person who learned that true scientific progress could never be separated from compassion and respect for life. And so, as the day came to an end, Helen knew that her story, which had begun with loss and despair, had transformed into something much greater than herself. It was a testimony to the power of love, truth, and the courage to do what is right, no matter the cost.